congratulations for this historic nomination. Professor Omarova will be the first woman, the first person of color, the first immigrant to serve as the Comptroller of the currency. She's one of the most qualified nominees ever for this job. She's widely regarded as a leading expert on banking law and policy. She holds a doctorate from the University of Wisconsin at Madison and a law degree from Northwestern. She's taught at the University of North Carolina, Senator Tillis, at Chapel Hill, and at Cornell University. She served as a senior advisor to the United States Treasury under a Republican administration. She's worked at one of New York's most prestigious banking law firms. Excuse me, she's an accomplished researcher and writer and has published dozens of works on topics critical to our understanding of the financial system. More than 70 financial regulatory experts from across the political spectrum, including, of course, bankers, have endorsed her nomination. She's testified in Congress many times before many different committees. She's found common ground with senators on both sides of the aisle. I'd urge my colleagues to review her discussion with Senator McCain for the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations when she testified on physical commodity trading and manipulation, or watch her conversation with my friend Mike Crapo on data privacy here in the Banking and Housing Committee. These are the serious policy conversations of a thoughtful, balanced professional. Some Republican senators have decided this job should not go to the most qualified candidate. Despite her unquestioned expertise and her bipartisan record, they've worked with their powerful friends in this town to degrade this confirmation process. Just a week after news of her nomination became public, the Wall Street Journal ran an op-ed, or maybe more accurately, a hit job.
Cameron, signing Senator Lumsden.
See, the Wall Street Journal, they even talk over me when I'm trying to talk. They highlighted she went to Moscow State University. They highlighted she received a scholarship named after Vladimir Lenin, neglecting to mention that pretty much everything in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s in the Soviet Union was named after Lenin. Besides, there was no Milton Friedman or Ronald Reagan scholarships available. They made outlandish, unfounded claims based on where she grew up. They say she believes the Soviet economic system was superior to ours. False. They accused her of wanting to establish communism rule over banking here in the United States. False again. The Wall Street Journal neglected to mention she renounced her communist citizenship and became an American. They neglected to mention she started her family here. They neglected to mention the deep ties she has to American universities where she studied and worked. They neglected to mention her patriotic service to her chosen country as the United States Department of the Treasury under President George W. Bush. Escaping communism, moving to America for a better life, embracing American values or hard work and public service. What could be more American than that? Only a few days after the op-ed was published, the ranking member piled on. He requested that Professor Omarova supply the committee with a paper that she had to write as an undergraduate. To be clear, this committee never requires anyone to submit unpublished undergraduate work as part of the nominations process. I don't remember any nominee who faced a similar request, nor do I think that what college kids write is generally a good guide for their policy views 3 decades later. So staff sitting behind me in both parties can breathe easy. If you aspire to a presidential nomination, you won't need to turn in your sophomore book reports on the Scarlet Letter. Not only did the ranking member request the paper, he put out a press release to tell the world that he was requesting this paper. He went out of his way to mention the same Lenin scholarship that the Wall Street Journal did. He liberally sprinkled the words Marx, Lenin, Moscow, Russian throughout, a total of 12 times, a dozen instances of guilt by association. And then he sent another press release. Since then, he and other Republican senators have taken to the floor to repeat these vile attacks that suggest this nominee doesn't share our American values. They have a formula. Start with a passing and inaccurate reference to her academic work. Distort the substance beyond recognition. Mix in words, Marx, Lenin, communism. End with insinuations about Professor Omarova's loyalties to her chosen country. That's how Republicans turn a qualified woman into a Marxist bogeyman. We know that some people in Washington have been calling their political opponents socialists and communists for years. I'll let Professor Omarova tell her own story, but I'd venture to guess that those words ring a little differently to those who've experienced communist oppression firsthand. We know that a shadowy political group funded by former Trump staff has been fomenting these personal attacks and pushing radical right-wing news sites to spread misinformation. These inflammatory insinuations continue to stoke the unhinged rhetoric that has poisoned our politics. Now we know what happens when Trumpism meets McCarthyism. It's a cruelty no person should experience. Professor Omarova and her family suffered generations of oppression under a communist dictatorship. She worked hard. She went to the best school she could in the United States. She became an American citizen. She started a family. She spent her career to give more Americans the opportunities that she was denied behind the Iron Curtain. That hard work got her where she is today. Just think about that. A Kazaki kid growing up in Soviet Central Asia. 30 years later, she sits before the Senate as the president's nominee for Comptroller of the Currency. Imagine that. She embodies everything we should celebrate: the fighting spirit that makes this nation great, the tenacity to strive for a better life, the openness and the opportunity of America that attracts the best minds from all over the world, from every kind of background. From growing up in the Soviet Union to escaping to build a new life here, to her enduring this last month of personal attacks with the dignity that she possesses, Professor Omarova has demonstrated the strength and independence she'll need to be a fair, impartial, and tough comptroller of the currency. She has both the private industry and the public policy experience to prevent a repeat of the financial crisis, a crisis that cost millions of Americans their homes and jobs and shuttered hundreds of community banks for whom she has fought. The Leadership Conference on Human and Civil Rights, the Center for Responsible Lending, the National Urban League, Unidos US, National Fair Housing Alliance, the National Community Investment Coalition. All these organizations have written a letter demanding a stop to these despicable attacks from their organizations on this nominee. I've worked with all of you in this committee, Republicans and Democrats alike, the new members and the more veteran members. I'd hope you'd all have a sense of decency today and moving forward. I expect my colleagues to treat Professor Omarova with the dignity and the respect she deserves. I ask you to listen, to really listen. Listen to her words as she shares her story. She shares her views about how she'll do this job. She shares with us how she wants to serve her fellow Americans. Ranking Member Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by acknowledging that Professor Omarova's thesis was certainly written a long time ago. The reason it is relevant is because it was advertised on her resume up through 2017. I think it would be completely relevant to this discussion. What apparently some of my Democratic colleagues want to really avoid is a full discussion of her policy views, but that's what we're going to have this morning. Now, I've read a variety of Professor Omarova's writings. I've watched her videos of her speaking. I have absolutely no doubt she's extremely intelligent, very knowledgeable, and she's an experienced law professor. My concern with Professor Omarova is her long history of promoting ideas that she herself describes as, quote, radical, end quote. I agree that they're radical, and they can fairly be described also as socialist. In fact, I've never seen a more radical nominee to be a federal regulator, and I'll be using her words. Let's talk about some of Professor Omarova's radical ideas. For starters, we know she wants to, and I quote, effectively end banking as we know it, end quote. Now, what does that mean? Well, she's told us what that means. In, quote, the People's Ledger, that's the name of a paper that she wrote, she published just last month. She outlined her plan for nationalizing retail banking. Under her plan, and I quote, central bank accounts fully replace, rather than uneasily coexist with, private bank deposits, end quote. So in other words, you couldn't have an account with a community bank. Your money would be held by the government at the Federal Reserve. Now, I remember well countless Pennsylvanians outraged over recent Democrat plans for the IRS to get a certain amount of personal banking information. Imagine their reaction to having the government actually take over their bank accounts. Professor Omarova also has a proposal to control the money supply through these individual Fed accounts, as she calls them, including when necessary, and I quote, implementing a contractionary monetary policy by debiting those accounts. Now, for those who are not accountants, debiting means basically subtracting. This, she allows, could be, and I quote, perceived as the government taking away people's money, end quote. Well, I think I know why it would be perceived that way. Because it would be the government taking away people's money. Professor Omarova's plan would devastate all banks, but especially community banks, because they rely on the deposit taking for the lending money to local businesses and residents. So what would happen to these banks under Professor Omarova's plan to outlaw their business model? Well, according to the People's Ledger that she wrote, Professor Omarova might allow these community banks to continue to exist, but only as, quote, franchisees, end quote, for the government, if they qualify for a license to, quote, operate physical branches and ATMs on the Fed's behalf, end quote. I see. Except that Professor Omarova would deny these banks their source of funding, which is deposits. And without a source of funding, banks can't very well lend to a woman who wants to open a new restaurant in town, a tool dye shop looking to expand, newlyweds who want to buy their first home, or pretty much anything else. Now, given that she wants community banks to become vassals of the government, it's no wonder that the Independent Community Bankers of America and banking associations from 41 states so far oppose her nomination. As Ricky Leal, Senior Vice President at First Community Bank in Texas, stated, and I quote, "The entire theory in banking, especially local community banking, is based on gathering up deposits from the local community and loaning back out into the local community so that those dollars are cycled through and stay local. You'd lose all that. A world without the local deposit, it would change banking as we know it," end quote. But of course, that's the idea. Professor Omarova says, again in the People's Ledger, that one reason she wants the Fed to become everyone's bank is to, and I quote, maximize its capacity to channel credit to productive uses in the nation's economy, end quote. Now, it's troubling to ponder how she or anyone in government would choose to define productive uses in our economy. How about loans to oil, gas, and coal companies? Would Professor Omarova consider them productive? Well, we actually know the answer. Earlier this year, at a social wealth seminar, she said publicly of these energy businesses, and I quote, "We want them to go bankrupt if we want to tackle climate change," end quote. She also said at an investment and decarbonization seminar this year, and I quote, "The way we basically get rid of those carbon financiers is we starve them of their source of capital," end quote. And she's created an entire blueprint for how the government could do this, and she has advocated her plan, including in testimony to Congress. Seems to me the last thing we need now, with some Americans paying close to $5 a gallon for gas and home heating costs soaring due to the Biden administration's disastrous energy policies, is a banking regulator who wants to push perfectly legal and economically necessary companies that employ millions of Americans into bankruptcy. But Professor Omarova's radical ideas don't stop there. She has a plan for the government, through the Fed, to replace the free market in setting what she calls, and I quote, systemically important prices, end quote. But these are things she lists. These are things like food, wages, energy. And since the administration's done such a great job on inflation, I'm sure Americans can't wait until the Fed starts directly controlling prices for eggs and milk and rent. And this isn't the only time that Professor Omarova has expressed support for government control on wages. As she tweeted in 2019, her words, and I quote, "Say what you will about the old USSR, there was no gender pay gap there. Market doesn't always know best," end quote. I suspect Professor Omarova may claim that as Comptroller of the Currency, she wouldn't have the power to enact all of her radical views. But the truth is, the Comptroller is a very powerful regulator. It wields enormous powers through bank chartering, regulation, enforcement, and especially through its opaque supervision process. The Comptroller is also a member of the FDIC board and the Financial Stability Oversight Council, America's financial super regulator. Professor Omarova may also claim that her writings are just thought experiments. But for the last decade, she's been a consistent, forceful advocate for these radical ideas in her writings, in public statements, and in testimony before Congress. Now, taken in their totality, her ideas do amount to a socialist manifesto for American financial services. She wants to nationalize the banking system, put in place price controls, create a command and control economy where the government allocates resources explicitly, instead of free men and women making their own decisions about the goods and services they want to buy and sell in an open market. These are exactly the kind of socialist ideas that have failed everywhere in the world they've been tried. In my view, Professor Omarova's policy views are too radical, and preserving the prosperity that our free market economy makes possible is too important to make her our nation's top banking regulator. So I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record letters of opposition to Professor Omarova's nomination from 65 industry, taxpayer advocate, consumer, and women's organizations, including the Independent Women's Forum, Independent Community Bankers of America, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, National Taxpayers Union, and banking associations from 41 states. I'd also like to enter into the record letters of opposition from 21 state auditors and treasurers representing 17 states and the governor of Texas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered. Thank you, Senator Toomey. Professor, would you rise and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Do you agree or appear and testify before any duly constituted committee of the Senate? Please be seated. Thank you. Professor, we welcome you to the committee. If you'd like to introduce family members or friends with you today, either in person or who are remote, I invite you to do that before beginning your testimony. Please begin. Thank you.
Sorry. Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, members of the committee, it is a great honor to appear before you today. Allow me to begin by thanking President Biden for the confidence and trust he placed in me by nominating me to be the Comptroller of the Currency. I'm deeply honored for another opportunity to serve my country as I did under President George W. Bush. I would also like to thank my husband, my son, and my mother, and all of my many friends for their love and support throughout the years. I appreciate the time many of the committee members have taken to meet with me personally. And for those of you who have not met me yet, I am happy to have a chance to share with you who I am and what I believe in. I grew up in an all-women household under a totalitarian regime presiding over a failing economy. My mother, a doctor at a local hospital, worked long hours just to make ends meet. I was raised by my grandmother, a soft-spoken woman who was orphaned and barely escaped death when, in the 1920s, Stalin sent her entire family to Siberia. The crime for which my grandmother's family was killed was that they were educated Kazakhs who did not join the party. That is why, to me, pursuing education and academic excellence was an act of defying political oppression and injustice. I studied hard, got into the best university I could, and was ultimately able to fulfill my dream of coming to America, the land of opportunity and freedom. I came to the United States in 1991 with one suitcase and a $50 bill in my pocket. I fell in love with this country and its people from day one. That was the beginning of my personal American dream. I earned a doctorate from the University of Wisconsin and a law degree from Northwestern University. I practiced banking law at one of the top law firms in New York City and served in the US Treasury under the George W. Bush administration. These experiences taught me invaluable lessons about how financial sausage is made and how that can lead to devastating financial crises. That is why my academic work has been focused on safeguarding the stability and resilience of our financial system. In the 2008 crisis, I saw what happens when powerful market players generate excessive risk and leverage outside of regulators' view, and then leave the American taxpayer to foot the bill when the speculative boom turns bust. We cannot afford a repetition of that destructive scenario, especially now in the aftermath of the global pandemic. If I'm confirmed to lead the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, my top priority will be to guarantee a fair and competitive market where small and mid-sized banks that invest in their neighbors' homes and small businesses can thrive, and where every community, regardless of wealth, geography, or history, has access to safe and affordable financial services. A critical part of that task is preserving and fostering the relationship banking that drives economic growth and creates local jobs and prosperity. I'm thinking here of my own local community bank in Ithaca, New York, Tompkins Trust, where they know every one of their customers and care about our community's needs. That is what I see as the true heart of American banking. Today, the community banks that perform the crucial function of extending credit to local small businesses and hardworking families are disappearing, leaving many urban and rural communities without meaningful access to financial services. Community banks are also forced to compete with big tech companies like Facebook that do not play by the same rules. These issues are deeply personal to me. Having grown up in an oppressive state-run system with no free enterprise and no economic opportunity, I have a unique appreciation for our dynamic and diverse markets. It is what made my life and success possible, and for that, I am forever grateful. Every American family should have the same opportunities that my family has had. If confirmed by the Senate, I will work to ensure that our financial system gives every family the tools they need to build their own American dream. I will pursue this goal alongside the committed career professionals at the OCC. I will serve the American public with the utmost dedication and integrity, and I will do everything in my power to protect and strengthen the safe and stable banking system that makes America work. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Professor Omarova. We've seen much of your work mischaracterized over the last couple of weeks. Do you want to end, just a few questions, do you want to end banking as we know it?
No, Senator, I do not want to end banking as we know it. I believe that our banking system is the best banking system in the world, although we could do better. This phrase was taken out of the paper that was written in the context of an ongoing academic debate on the future of digital money, central bank digital currencies, and stable coins. As you know, according to Fed Chairman Powell, the Fed is currently considering issuing the digital dollar. China is already piloting its digital yuan. Facebook is piloting its diem. Whether to digitize the US dollar and how to do it is entirely up to Congress and the Federal Reserve. Writing as an academic, I was simply trying to grapple with what that might look like. My worry is that if we take this step without fully understanding the implications of it, we may hurt community banks and mid-sized banks that would experience the flight of business of banking to bigger players like big tech companies and Wall Street platform-based financial institutions. So I have never said that this particular proposal or the Fed accounts is the best solution that Congress should take or the only solution that Congress should consider, only that it might be one of the options Congress should consider.
Thank you. One of the striking things to me about your writings is your support of community banks in a whole host of different ways. Let's talk about some of the other issues that have been brought up. Natural gas is a big industry in Ohio. Energy jobs are important in my neighbor state and the ranking member state. News reports have highlighted you're saying you want to bankrupt oil and gas companies. Do you want to do that?
No, Senator, absolutely not. That was a poor phrasing, I admit to it. I do understand that energy companies are a very important part of our American economy. Millions of Americans work in the energy sector. But in recent years, we've seen many instances where especially small energy companies have experienced hard times and even went bankrupt, leaving workers with nowhere to go. So what I was actually saying in that particular presentation is that we need to think collectively about finding new ways of helping workers in this sector to transition to higher paying jobs if we're looking into the future and the rise of new technologies.
Thank you. I want to ask you about the personal attacks that you faced, unprecedented as far as I've seen, to a nominee in front of this committee. Your biggest critics can't help but mention you were born in the Soviet Union and attended university in Moscow. When did you become an American citizen?
I became an American citizen in 2005. And immediately after that, I renounced my Kazakhstani citizenship.
Do you have any loyalties to any communist parties or any Marxist or Leninist ideas?
No, I don't. I absolutely don't. I've lived through that regime. I've lived through that system. I have absolutely no affection or affiliation with any of those ideas.
And some of your family members, before you were born, but some of your family members were murdered by that regime, correct?
That is correct. I come from the people who has been oppressed under the Soviet regime, lost probably a quarter of its population to its efforts to sedentarize nomadic Kazakhs. My own family has suffered persecution. So yes, that is absolutely correct.
Thank you for your candor. I hope the rest of this hearing will be focused on what's really at stake, American families, the financial system. And just last question, what's your vision for the job the president's nominated you for as Comptroller of the Currency?
Senator, if I am confirmed to be the Comptroller of the Currency, I will do my best to uphold the mission of the OCC, which is to safeguard the safe and stable and competitive operation of the national banking system. I would do my best to ensure that every American family, every American business, every American community has access to credit.
Thank you. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Omarova, in your article, which was published in a law review journal last month, was entitled "The People's Ledger." That's the title. And you did advocate nationalizing the business of retail banking. In your words, and I quote, "This article outlines a series of structural reforms that would radically redefine the role of a central bank as the ultimate public platform for generating, modulating, and allocating financial resources in a democratic economy, the people's ledger," end quote. You also said this article accordingly advocates full migration of demand deposits onto the Fed's balance sheet. Now, this is meant to create a system. Well, that's a quote, right? This article accordingly advocates full migration of demand deposits onto the Fed's balance sheet, end quote. According to your article, and I quote, "The proposed reform will effectively end banking." You put "end banking" in quotes, but this is all your quote. "The proposed reform will effectively end banking as we know it." These are all direct quotes. This is not my characterization. Do you stand by these policy proposals that you published last month?
Senator, thank you for your question. So let me give a little bit of the context about this particular
I've got
paper.
very little time, so please be very succinct. I have more questions.
Of course, Senator. So as I said, this paper was written in the context of an ongoing academic debate on how to approach digitizing the dollar, because this seems to be an inevitable solution. The paper seeks to address the implications of that step for the entire financial system. The particular phrase that has attracted so much attention was actually my quoting a title, the title of a book that somebody else wrote about fintech effectively ending banking. My concern is
the phase that's more interesting, not interesting, disturbing to me isn't necessarily ending banking as we know it, although that's exactly what would happen, but it is your phrase in which, and I'll quote again, "This article accordingly advocates full migration of demand deposits onto the balance sheet." I read a lot of this paper, and it is clear to me that you are not referring exclusively to a central bank digital currency. You're talking about all demand deposits going to the Federal Reserve. Now, are you now saying you're no longer for that?
Senator, what I'm trying to clarify here is the problem this paper was trying to solve. The problem this paper was trying to solve was the fact that if we allow digitization of currency and the issuance of central bank digital currency without thinking through its implications, community banks and mid-sized banks will be put inherently in a losing position.
But Professor Omarova, you've advocated that they lose all their deposits. And then you acknowledge that that means they wouldn't have the resources to lend money. And so you've constructed this whole mechanism whereby they could go to the Fed and get funding to make the loans, provided that they made loans in a fashion that the Fed approved of. I mean, that's the short version. Let me go on to another quote. Because this is right from that very same article published last month. You said, and I quote, "In principle, Fed accounts can be made available as an alternative to bank deposit accounts upon a person's request. As explained below, however, the more effective option would be to transition all deposits to the Fed." That sounds pretty straightforward. When you use words like advocate, and you talk about the proposal, and you talk about a preferred option, it sounds like that's what you were for. Are you no longer for those things?
Senator, being a legal academic, there is a particular way we write our ideas. Unlike economists, for example, we cannot simply claim it's an assumption and there is a model. So having said that, I just want to clarify, my job as an academic was to expand the boundaries of the academic debate and outline potential options for Congress to consider. This is entirely up to Congress whether or not to go that route.
Sure, of course, ultimately. But this is what you recommended, and it doesn't seem to be a coincidence that every one of these thought experiments or academic ideas, every one of them, involved dramatic expansion in the power and control of the central government to allocate resources to control banking, and a corresponding diminution in the freedom of individual Americans and institutions. That's the common theme that comes up again and again and again. You use words like advocate, your preference. I mean, to suggest now that, well, maybe you're not really for these things, it's just hard. It's hard to believe this. We'll have more time in the second round, but I want to underscore the powers of the Comptroller of the currency are enormous. Powers to decide who gets to open a bank account, who doesn't, what kind of loans can and can't be offered. The opportunity to exercise a radical ideology through the powers of the Comptroller of the currency are chilling. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Reid from Rhode Island is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to join the chairman in recognizing the skill and the insights and the preparation of Dr. Omarova. She's qualified for this position. I, too, am disturbed by the personal attacks. They're a diversion, really, from the issues that we have to raise, and I hope we can raise here, because they're serious. Dr. Omarova has seen the banking system from about every angle you can think of, from a prestigious New York City law firm in which I assume, Doctor, you represented banks. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, we have represented some of the biggest financial institutions.
Yes, and they were, I'm sure, very pleased with your representation on their behalf.
I believe so.
Yeah. And then also with the George W. Bush administration, and I don't think, I don't know former President Bush that well, but I don't think he was in a habit of appointing Marxist, socialist, Leninists to public office. So that, I think, is another aspect of this. And just a comment, I think I'll commend the ranking member. I think his comments and his questions are very insightful. But one of the things I think the bank industry does with regularity is if they don't like provisions in a particular regulator, they change their charters. There are so many community banks that are state chartered that are not governed by the Comptroller of currency, and has also indicated too, any type of significant change would require statutory, would require this Congress to agree. The articles that have been discussed, and you've, I think, tried to put them in context, is we face a extraordinary shift with respect to digital currencies, with respect to all of these factors. And there is a possibility, because they're virtually unregulated now, that private companies, unrelated to the Federal Reserve, could start essentially setting our monetary policy. Is that the context of your academic pursuit?
Yes, Senator, you are absolutely correct. This is exactly the context for my academic pursuits, particularly with respect to the digital currency and potential options we or Congress might take in this direction. My concern is that digitization of the dollar would give an inherent and inerodable structural advantage to large players like Facebook and other big tech companies. So whether or not community banks survive depends on what you, senators, decide to do to protect them. My academic work was driven purely by the desire to give you a greater range of options, potential alternatives to consider. Like I said, I do not presume that any of the proposals I've made is the only proposal or the best proposal you should consider.
Now, we are in the midst of the revelations about Facebook's operating procedures, et cetera. And it's quite possible, given the current context of laws, not just in the United States, but internationally, that Facebook basically could design a digital currency, could operate to the extent that it's so much in use. In fact, I think Tesla for a while was experimenting with using digital currency to buy cars, that the US dollar becomes something that can't be used to regulate our economy. And also, by the way, national banks and local banks would essentially say, I don't need a federal charter. I just have to get a franchise in Facebook. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. This is the scary scenario that I think everybody should take seriously these days.
You know, the irony here is, you know, we face this same dilemma with respect to social media, et cetera, going back 10, 15 years. And this Congress really wasn't provoked to think through it. We just sort of sat there and give, here, whatever you want, take it. And guess what? They've taken it. And now we're facing this crisis, actually, institutional democratic crisis of what controls must we put on these algorithms, et cetera. And if we lose the power, and I think this is why you want to get us to think hard, if the Federal Reserve loses the monetary power to regulate this economy, then we are in very difficult circumstances.
Thank you, Senator. I think you've summarized my work probably better than I did. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Reid. Senator Shelby from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to associate first be associated with the remarks of Senator Toomey. He raised a lot of important questions here before the committee today about the nominee. I think he's spot on. I have all those reservations, but I have a couple of questions I'd like to propound to the lady. First of all, I've always thought that economic analysis has served an important role in ensuring regulations, that regulations in the banking and financial field are efficient and convenient, consistent too. You know, regulations mean things. They got to be fair. For a lot of years here on the Banking Committee, and this is my 35th year on the Banking Committee here, administrations of both political parties, Democrats and Republicans, have worked to improve and to further utilize economic analysis in the regulatory process to try to get it right. You've been critical of the use of economic theory and empirical data as the basis for financial regulation, but that's what we do. In a paper that you wrote in February of 2020, just a little over a year ago, you rejected the idea that good financial regulation is, quote, carefully limited, facially objective, politically neutral, and technically expertise. Do you still believe, Doctor, do you believe that carefully limited, objective, and neutral regulations are bad for our financial system?
Senator, first of all, thank you for this question. I actually believe that you and I share a lot of the same ideas with respect to what should underlie regulatory policy. I agree with you that economic analysis and reliance on empirical data are absolutely critical to smart decision-making by the regulators. This particular paper was a little bit different in what I was trying to do. What I was trying to do was think about how the financial regulators need to change their way of thinking, to broaden their way of thinking now that we are not dealing with regular old stock certificates written on paper, but we're dealing with digital assets. We're dealing with financial technologies that make financial transactions instantaneous. It changes the context in which financial regulators have to do their jobs. My view of the job, particularly of the Comptroller of the currency, is to prevent the next crisis. It's to make our banking system safe, sound, strong, and competitive. And in the new context of how technology changes finance, what I was trying to tell my academic fellows and regulators that we need to start maybe broadening our horizons.
Do you still disagree with using economic theory and empirical data for the basis of financial regulation?
Senator, I do not disagree with that and have never disagreed with that. So I believe that I completely understand where you're coming from.
Do you believe that our banking system is the glue that helps hold our market economy together?
Senator, I'm so glad you asked me this question because it gives me an opportunity to reiterate. I absolutely believe that our American banking system, private banks that channel credit into businesses, families, communities, is absolutely critical to our American economy. And we need to do everything in our power to make sure that that system stays strong, competitive, and is subject to the rules of the free and fair market. This is not just an issue of economic progress, it's an issue of national security these days.
Do you believe that the community banks, our smaller independent banks all over this country, contribute greatly to our economic well-being and job creation process?
Senator, I absolutely believe in that, and I agree with that. I will never forget, if I may, when I came to America in 1991, I will never forget the first time I opened a checking account at the University of Wisconsin Credit Union, and holding that checkbook in my hand was the symbol of economic autonomy and freedom, and I would not want people of America to lose that.
Some of your testimony here today is in contrast to a lot of your published writings, and that's troubling to me. I'm troubled by your nomination. I know you've got a great story personally, and you're academically qualified. I understand that, but I don't think you fit in this job. I'd hope that that nominates you for some other job that you'd probably be more qualified for. I cannot support you for Comptroller of the Currency. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Menendez from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Omarova, a lot has been said about your background. Let me ask you, my understanding is that your grandmother was orphaned because Stalin sent her entire family to Siberia and they died there. Is that true?
That is absolutely true, Senator.
And what did that teach you about the communist system?
What that taught me about the communist system is that it is oppressive, it doesn't care about human beings, and it kills its own citizens for no other reason but the refusal to follow what an oppressive state government ideology tells them to do. What that taught me also is that in that system, you do what you have to do to survive, so you can fight against it. I chose to come to this country. I chose to become a U.S. citizen. And in everything I do, no matter how people may interpret my academic work, my one goal is to make this country better and stronger so we can never have a repetition of that communist system anywhere in the world.
You know, I think only when, as my parents came from a communist system, only when you live in such a system can you understand what is necessary to survive. But you seek to ultimately revolt against it in every way you can, and those have different manifestations to it. It also teaches us that under such a system, freedom of thought, academic thought, is not something that is truly free. Is that true?
That is absolutely
And
true.
so when you are pursuing academic thought, it is a question of exploring out of the box. It does not necessarily mean that such thoughts are, at the end of the day, the pragmatic thoughts that you would put into place if you had the power to do so.
Senator, you're absolutely correct. I've lived for many years in a system where I was afraid to speak my mind. Everybody was afraid to speak my mind. Academic freedom, freedom of thought, freedom of speech are something that I value incredibly deeply and personally in this country.
Let me ask you something that would be specific to your job. The Community Reinvestment Act is an important civil rights law. I hope upon your confirmation that you work on a revamped CRA rule that will deal with some of the challenges we have with minority, small and mid-sized business owners, lack of access to credit, a problem particularly evidenced in minority communities hit disproportionately hard by the pandemic. What changes do you think the OCC should implement to ensure that banks, through the CRA, are better serving minority businesses?
So thank you, Senator. I agree with you that the Community Reinvestment Act is a critical civil rights era law, and I'm glad that financial regulators, banking regulators, including the current acting comptroller of the currency, are working together on modernizing the framework for assessing the performance of our banks with respect to channeling credit into low and moderate income communities, communities of color, rural areas, and other current banking deserts. If confirmed as the comptroller, I intend to take the CRA performance and the implementation of the newly revamped rule very seriously. The OCC's primary toolkit is, of course, supervision. And I would want to talk to the professionals at the OCC about what they see as the key issues on the ground that stand in the way of making sure that our banks fulfill their CRA duties properly.
Right. And then finally, I think maybe some within the financial institutions who oppose your nomination is because you're not from the same old boy system, and therefore are concerned about how you might ultimately regulate. There have been some of the biggest high-profile scandals at banks like Wells Fargo. These scandals not only cause direct harm to consumers, they erode trust in the financial system, and the old boy system seemed to have let them do exactly that. If confirmed, how would you improve oversight of large financial institutions to prevent such scandals and risk as these that have been talked about? And do you believe that when examiners are embedded in financial institutions, they run the risk of becoming too familiar with the institution they regulate, resulting in regulatory capture?
Yes, thank you so much for your question. I think it's a very important issue. I have deep respect for bank examiners at the OCC and other banking agencies. I realize how hard that job is. But I also understand that allowing particularly large financial institutions to repeatedly commit fraud and hurt their customers seriously undermines the trust and confidence in our banking system. And I think it's the job of a fair and impartial regulator that stands in the shoes of the American public to enforce the laws as they're written and to make sure that they use all the tools in their toolkit to ensure that such things do not happen anymore.
Thanks, Senator. Senator Crapo from Idaho is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Professor Omarova, as has been reviewed today, you've written on numerous topics and have frequently used the word radical to describe your own policy ideas. You've advocated for policies that would remake our entire financial system, such as advocating for government allocation of capital and credit through transfer of banking functions to the Federal Reserve, fully replacing private bank deposits, and in your own words, support policies that would effectively end banking as we know it. It's not surprising that the Independent Community Bankers of America have urged opposition to your nomination. Under your People's Ledger proposal, for example, community banks will be relegated to serving as representative offices of the Federal Reserve. Today, of course, they fund their balance sheets and lending operations primarily through FDI-insured deposits. The People's Ledger would make community banks almost wholly dependent on the Federal Reserve for funding through the discount window. And this funding would be contingent on the extension of, quote, qualified, end quote, loans in accordance with specified underwriting and other eligibility criteria. This could easily lead to the politicization of credit allocation, which is what I understand you advocate. This proposal is an anathema to community banks and our free market system. The core mission of community banks is support for small business and their households based on their knowledge and their borrowers and their communities. As recently as March in 2021, you said that we want certain of these disfavored industries to go away and that we want them to go bankrupt if we want to tackle climate change. Today you said you didn't mean that phrase, But later, in May of that same year, you proceeded to call for the debanking of these industries, saying the way we basically get rid of these carbon financiers is we starve them of their source of capital. Furthermore, you've proposed allowing the government to block credit to what you've called socially suboptimal industries. From your writings, we know that that includes the carbon industry, but I take issue with these statements. And I just don't believe that we should be encouraging our financial institutions or directing our financial institutions to bankrupt industries for political purposes. Let's not forget that the idea of controlling the allocation of capital is not new. In a recent administration, we had a project called Operation Chokepoint, which sought to do exactly this. This time, one of its targets was the firearms industry. They were targeted by the federal government and the regulators and restricted in their ability to access banking services. Operation Chokepoint was real, and it exceeded its legal limits. Professor, given your statements, how can we be confident that you won't pursue such radical actions as the head of the OCC and literally seek to starve legal and lawful industries of capital simply because they are viewed as politically unfavorable?
Senator, thank you for asking this question because it gives me a chance to provide some context and clarify my statements. I'm not sure that's a correct characterization of whatever I said about the oil and gas companies as calling for debanking. It was not made in the context of what banks should or should not do. I believe in private allocation of capital, and I believe in the fact that it should be banks making decisions to which company to lend and on what conditions, subject to the regulatory and supervisory requirements that they do it prudently. And the OCC's job is not to meddle into specific decisions on credit allocation on the ground. And as a regulator, if I'm confirmed, I fully intend to follow the rules and the law as it's written. The OCC's job is simply to ensure that when banks make those decisions, that they fully identify, understand, and account for the risks they're taking. And that's my position.
Well, you've just highlighted the point that I make. It's been suggested here that you can't achieve your objectives without Congress's approval. But under Operation Chokepoint and other efforts that we've seen through the regulatory agencies, their power of supervision can be used without Congress's permission to allocate capital. And I just have a great concern. Do you believe that the firearms industry is a socially suboptimal industry?
Senator, I do not think much of firearm industries. I believe that if I'm confirmed as the Comptroller of the currency, my job will be simply to make sure that all national banks are safe and sound, and they take into account all the risk factors when they decide to lend to one business or another business. That is not going to be up to me.
My time has expired, but let me just say that is exactly the argument that was made under Operation Chokepoint, that we can evaluate the risk of these socially suboptimal industries and through our supervisory power drive them out of their source of capital. And that is an incredibly dangerous concept for us to be building into our system.
Thanks, Senator Crapo. Senator Tester from Montana is recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and thank you for being here today, Professor. I appreciate you putting yourself out there. I will tell you I have been disappointed by comments criticizing where the nominee was born, where she grew up, what her education was, going after her heritage. I think we really need to focus on our ideas, and there should be no place for that. Professor Omarova, I appreciate meeting with you earlier this week, and you have a compelling story. I am sorry that you've had to face what I see as unfair and unacceptable tax. I do, however, have some significant concerns about positions that you have taken, including as a witness before this banking committee related to our financial system, bank regulation, and on legislation related to the OCC. In my office, we discussed your opposition to a bill that I helped write, the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act, which was signed into law back in 2018. You've described it as dismantling and weakening regulation and supervision. The OCC is responsible for enforcing, implementing, and overseeing provisions of this statute. So what specifically did you oppose about my bipartisan legislation?
Thank you, Senator, for this question. I testified in connection with S-2155 to express my deep concern about inadvertently loosening the regulatory oversight of the largest financial institutions that engage in high-risk trading operations that do not necessarily follow the traditional relational banking model. However, as I said in my testimony, I was fully supportive, and I remain fully supportive, of tailoring regulatory requirements and lightening the regulatory burden on community banks and smaller banks that do not engage in such activity.
Thank you for that. What do you consider a big bank?
It is difficult to say in terms of the specific bright line asset size. I know that now it's the law of the land that anything below $250 billion is not considered a systemically important financial institution.
Do you agree with that?
I agree with that, yes.
Okay, so you think big banks are the ones over $250 billion?
I believe that a bank that has $2 trillion in assets, that's a big bank.
And do you believe that S-2155 helped those banks? Yes or no
I
will work?
think-
A yes or no will work? I heard you say earlier that you thought it
Yes,
helped
yes.
the big
I
banks.
think
so-
I think in indirectly, it might have helped the big banks.
Okay. This has been hit before on this committee, but I want to touch on it again. You've written that the private sector doesn't allocate capital well and that private capital allocation causes destabilization. Do you think that your National Investment Authority would do a better job at this?
The National Investment Authority proposal is meant not to supplant or replace private allocation of capital, but to supplement it and provide an additional set of investment opportunities for private capital in the kinds of projects that naturally and rationally do not get funded in private markets because of their high risk or long-term to profitability.
So it is to supplement, not to supplant.
Yes.
Although, and this was brought up by Senator Crapo and others earlier, a recorded event earlier, you said you wanted small coal, oil, and gas companies to go bankrupt to combat climate change. The challenge here is that in my real life, I farm. I'm a small family farmer in eastern Montana. There could be somebody in a position that would say, you know what? The big guys are far more efficient. They do a much better job. Our food security would be better served if you went out of business. Now, there's arguments for that. I can make arguments on the other side, by the way, and damn good ones. Do you see how risky that is to make that statement?
I'm sorry, Senator.
That statement about taking certain industries and saying, you know what, I believe this, so we
Right,
need to
right.
do it.
Right.
With one person making that potential decision, and you are we have oversight, but you're a one-man shop. Do you see how dangerous that could be?
Senator, I do not intend to advocate that kind of a position. That particular statement about oil and gas companies going bankrupt, as I said, that was taken out of context, and I actually misspoke. That was not well framed. My intention was actually saying was exactly the opposite, that we need to help those companies to get restructured.
Thank you for being here. We have additional questions for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Tester. Senator Scott from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to note that not a single Republican on this committee has mentioned anything other than your position related to your nomination. I keep hearing my friends on the other side refer to personal attacks. One thing I can say and be very proud of on this committee from these Republicans, not a single person has talked about anything other than your stated positions as it relates to this nomination. So any suggestions otherwise is simply hogwash. I want to be fair, and I will be fair. I won't be hyperbolic, but I will be frank and honest. I cannot think of a nominee more poorly suited to be the Comptroller of the currency based solely on your public positions, statements, and the weight of your writings than you are. Let me just quote you versus anybody else. On the Green New Deal champion, you proposed taking economic and climate policy making from Congress and creating an unaccountable bureaucracy called the National Investment Authority. In a roundtable this year, you pushed to make the NIA the dedicated institutional platform at the federal level for really being the kind of fighting muscle of the Green New Deal and fighting muscle of, all of these other movements that pursuing environmental justice, social, economic justice, equality, and so on. Your disdain for the financial services industry. In 2019, in a documentary titled, I'll be kind, Buttholes, A Theory, you said, the financial services industry, in my view, and I don't think I'm alone here, is the quintessential butthole industry. Killing American Energy and Jane Family Institute seminar in March of this year, you proposed bankrupting the coal and oil and gas industries, saying we want them to go bankrupt if we want to tackle the climate change. That's really hard to misunderstand. On nationalizing banking, last year, i.e. 2020, not 10 years ago, not 20 years ago, just last year, paper you titled, The People's Ledger, How to Democratize Money and Finance the Economy. You proposed reforms to, and I quote, effectively end banking as we know it by nationalizing, the quote you had was effectively ending banking as we know it. How? By nationalizing retail banking. As it relates to the end of private banking, your words, no one else's. This year, not 5 years ago, not 10 years ago, not 20 years ago, this year, you said, you proposed to imagine what it would be like if instead of just a public option for deposit banking, instead of just a public option for deposit banking, this would be actually the full transition. In other words, there would be no more private bank deposit accounts, and all of the deposit accounts would be held directly at the Fed. I want to say that one more time because this is what really, among all the other comments, it's quite disturbing. This is not a position that you took years ago. This is something that you spoke to this year. And I quote, imagine what it would be like if, instead of just a public option for deposit banking, this would be actually the full transition. In other words, there would be no more private bank deposit accounts, and all of the deposit accounts will be held directly at the Fed. I don't have any questions for you because there's nothing you can say today to undo what you've said for years, including this year. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Scott. Senator Warner of Virginia is recognized from his office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Omarova, it is good to see you at least remotely, and I very much enjoyed our meeting, and I am impressed by your intellect and your background in true American success story. I do have to say I joined my friend Senator Tester, though, and pretty disappointed in your views on Senate Bill 2155, of which I was proud to be one of the authors as well. A bill that I would remind you got 69 votes. And as somebody who was very involved in the Dodd-Frank legislation, where I think we put appropriate restrictions on some of the largest institutions, I think 2155 helped our smaller institutions, some of the mid-sized to smaller regional banks. I can assure you that some of the larger regional banks, even one located in my state, are still bitterly disappointed with me because it did not extend the kind of protections to the larger institutions. So I would I very much disagree with your characterization of that bill and point out again, it's hard to get 69 votes on anything in U.S. Senate, and I think it was a good piece of legislation. As you may know, I've spent a lot of time recently, in the last couple of years, in light of the COVID crisis, working on the incredible important role of CDFIs and MDIs. I think we saw in the 2021 CDFI survey that a whole lot of particularly low and moderate income folks went to CDFIs because they were the only institutes of last resort. What more could the Comptroller's office do to encourage larger banks to support CDFI sector in terms of their greatest needs, things like capital, liquidity, and technical assistance?
Yes, thank you, Senator. First, let me just reiterate again that S2155 has done a tremendous job of lowering the regulatory burden on smaller community banks, and I think it's a great thing. If confirmed as the Comptroller, I will fully uphold the congressional intent and make sure that that law is implemented as intended. It actually is not at all incongruent with my views. With respect to CDFIs and MDIs, again, I'm really glad you brought that up because community development and especially channeling of the credit to minority-owned businesses who feel clearly more comfortable and more likely to get a loan by going to an MDI or a CDFI is a very important priority for the control of the currency. If confirmed, I intend to make the support for these institutions one of my biggest priorities. We really need to make sure that American families and American communities that were hit so hard by this pandemic really have fair access to credit and capital that they need in order to rebuild our economy. So thank you so much for bringing it up. And of course, if I'm confirmed, I will be happy to work with you in your office on how to implement that goal in practice.
Dr. Omarova, thank you for that answer. I mean, I want to move to another piece of the job, the management of the OCC. 3,500 employees, 90 offices, oversight of 1,200 banks. I think we've seen with the constant turnover at the OCC some real management challenges. How do we make sure that we keep up both recruitment and retention of highly qualified examiners, particularly in terms of FinCEN, something this committee, again, the chairman and Senator Crapo and I and others worked on. How do we make sure we do that? And how do we make sure, as we get into this last minute, too often the OCC has been about box checking rather than actual oversight. So speak to how you would address some of the management challenges, retention of examiners, and trying to change this culture from, simply checking the box oversight to actual meaningful review of the institutions you'd have oversight over.
Yes, thank you, Senator. I think you put your finger right on the most important issue for the control of the currency as the head of a large and very complex agency. I have learned in my years of practicing law on Wall Street and working in the Treasury that it is important not to come into an agency or any big organization and start doing things without first talking to the people in the building. So the first thing I intend to do is to really speak to the supervisory personnel at the OCC and perhaps do even a listening tour of the regional offices in order to understand what needs to be done in order to address the concern you've raised, which I fully share. Thank you.
I'll have some more questions again on follow-up on this management issue, but thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warner. Senator Rounds is recognized from South Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been listening to the comments so far, Professor, and Dr. Omarova. I'm just curious. I have a very difficult time in recognizing the appropriateness of you to be placed in this position. But I also want to give you an opportunity to respond to some things, and I'd like to just point out, I come from South Dakota where we've got 67 community banks. They have 393 different branches. I think Senator Crapo touched on it a little bit, but I'd like to expand. How would you justify removing the critical relationship between bankers and their communities that has allowed for decades of locally sponsored economic growth, other than your belief that the government seems to always know best. And by that I mean, it would appear that you believe that you advocate for a full migration of demand deposits onto the Fed's balance sheet. Now, it would seem to me that in a classroom, you would have a very lively discussion with members of your class, and I suspect that would be entertaining, but I'm really challenged to see how that could be put into, and that you would be trusted to be the person responsible for the management, or at least the oversight of these different banks. And I'd like to give you at least a little bit of time here to explain that process.
Well, Senator, thank you very much for this question. I find it difficult to explain what is a complex piece of academic work in simple, buzzwords, if you will. But I want to make one thing clear. I believe in the American banking system. I believe in the community banking system. I do not think that whatever Congress decides to do with respect to digital dollar or Fed accounts, whether or not Congress chooses to go that route, whatever Congress chooses, I think it is absolutely critical to make sure that community banks and their role in the provision of financial services is preserved. My fear is that that role is being eroded, and it's been an ongoing trend for the last 25, 30 years.
Let me just,
yes.
because I want to hit on a couple of other items real quick, and I know that we're not professors up here, but you'd be responsible for working with bankers across the entire United States, and you clearly have scared the heck out of them. They've been doing business for hundreds of years, and they have modified based upon the directions of regulators. But a regulator who suggests significant changes in what has been a successful opportunity to provide consumers with lots of credit opportunities and in a growing economy seems to me to be a real challenge for them to accept, and one that they'd prefer not to. I do have a question, though, with regard to, you've discussed what would be, I guess, described as suboptimal social businesses, socially suboptimal activities of businesses. But I don't think we've had the opportunity to ask you what it is that you view as socially suboptimal activities. There's a lot of activities that are clearly that you think that have been financed that you would do your best to stop from being financed. Is that what this means? And what is give us an example of a socially suboptimal activity.
Well, Senator, again, thank you for the opportunity to sort of answer this question and perhaps clarify some of my positions. I fully understand the difference between being an academic and being a regulator, and working with bankers and working with all other constituencies on making sure that our banking system really channels credit into the productive enterprise, meaning non-speculative, actual businesses, small businesses, large businesses in various areas. And it is not the job of the OCC to decide which specific business should or should not get a specific loan from a specific bank. I have never advocated that, and I believe that it is up to Congress to
with all due respect, in the People's Ledger, which is your work, on page 1272 of the paper, you write that in that new role, the Fed would impose activity limitations on lenders in order to direct credit to productive enterprise as opposed to socially suboptimal speculative activities. Now, that would suggest the work of a regulator, and that, to me, seems to be moving in the wrong direction.
Senator, this is the banking law we already have in place. We do have the Bank Holding Company Act that imposes limitations on the ability, on the activities that bank holding companies, conglomerates engage in. And that act is being administered by the Federal Reserve.
But as a regulator, and my time has expired, but just please, and I'll ask one more time because you haven't had the opportunity, what is a socially suboptimal activity?
This is not up to the regulator to decide. This is a policy decision for Congress. Congress constantly, often makes decisions with respect to what kind of activities we want to promote and what kind of activities we don't want to promote. For example, money laundering, terrorist financing. On the one hand, one could say these are legitimate business activities, but Congress made a decision many times over that those activities are suboptimal from our social safety and public policy perspective. So as the regulator, I will not ever step in the shoes of either the private entities or Congress with respect to making those decisions.
My time has expired. Thank you for your...
Thank you, Senator Rounds. Senator Smith from Minnesota is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Brown and Ranking Member Toomey. And Dr. Omarova, thank you so much for your willingness to serve. I am grateful for you stepping up even in these most divisive of times. And in our conversations and in my reading of your work and qualifications, I have been wholly impressed. We had a chance to talk a little bit about community banking when we met virtually, so I want to follow up on that conversation. And I told you that my grandmother, Avis Iden Mason, who was born in 1898, was a community banker. Her father started the bank, and he was blessed with 3 daughters and no sons, and so my grandmother and her 2 sisters ran that bank. And I remembered dearly and clearly going to visit her and understanding the role that that bank played, because my grandmother and her sisters knew their customers and they knew their communities. Those folks were more than just an entry in a spreadsheet or a data bit in an algorithm. They were their neighbors. And I have to say also, Dr. Omarova, I bet that my grandmother would have had a thing to do or say about what it's like for women to lead in the banking sector, even back in the 40s and 50s and 60s. In Minnesota, we rank 3rd in the nation, actually, in the number of community banks. They're critical to our state, especially in the small towns and rural places that big banks often don't serve. So could you, there's been a lot of statements made about your position on community banking, where you stand on this. Could you just talk to us about how you see the role of community banks in our financial system? And if you're confirmed, describe how you'll approach your role when it comes to regulating community banks.
That's right. Thank you so much, Senator, for this question. I believe that community banks are absolutely the backbone of our American banking system. They are the backbone of that system because they channel credit into real businesses, small businesses, into the real communities, their neighbors effectively. And that is how they generate local jobs and support economic growth. Community banks is not about just the size. It's about the nature of their business. They lend. They do not run complex, risky trading operations. And therefore, I believe that they should be subject to a much more reasonable, tailored regulatory oversight than, for example, large, complex financial institutions that run trading operations in addition to lending. And if I'm confirmed as the Comptroller of the currency, I fully intend to have an absolutely open door policy for all the banks of all sizes and all risk profiles, but my special priority would be to protect, preserve, and strengthen the ability of community banks to do what they do best.
Thank you. So in Minnesota and across the country, community banks are getting gobbled up by big banks and by bigger financial institutions. In fact, my grandmother's bank was bought up years ago. And I'm concerned about big banks and these voracious big tech companies that are increasingly squeezing out community banks that are so important. So, Dr. Omarova, could you talk about that dynamic that we see in the financial sector right now? And as Comptroller of the currency, how do you see your role in ensuring that there's a level playing field for consumer banks, for community banks, in a world where big banks and big tech are elbowing in?
Yes, thank you, Senator. This is a very important problem right now because, of course, the technological advances, they favor large institutions that have the resources and the expertise and the capability to build huge technological platforms and basically take business away from community banks and drive them out of the business. I think it is critical to ensure a level playing field so we protect the relational banking model from being decimated. And if I'm confirmed as the Comptroller of the currency, I would make sure that we do everything we can to facilitate community banks' ability to innovate responsibly, to join the technological progress without being gobbled up by those companies that actually do not play by the same rules and therefore have a greater advantage.
Thank you very much. You know, Dr. Omarova, I think that one of the reasons that the Wall Street banks are fighting so hard against your nomination is because they are afraid that you will be a regulator who is capable and committed of holding them accountable and putting consumers first. And, you know, for too long, let's be honest, for too long, the OCC has had comptrollers who are very chummy with the big banks and who have let bad actors go with just a slap on the wrist. I mean, the stories, there are so many examples. In 2018, JP Morgan Chase reportedly charged 170,000 customers wrong overdraft fees. And what did the OCC do? Well, JP Morgan got away with out paying a dime in fees. Since 2017, the OCC has found at least 6 banks wrongly charged overdrafts, and in each case, the agency basically put a note in their file rather than pushing for real consequences. And who this hurts are the people that are targeted by this kind of behavior. So if big banks are worried about your nomination, I think it's because they're worried that you're going to be independent, because you'll put the interests of consumers first, because you understand how banking works and you know how to hold them accountable. And that's exactly the kind of comptroller that I want to see at the OCC. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Smith. Senator Kennedy from Louisiana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
You used to be a member of a group called the Young Communist, didn't you?
Senator, are you referring to my membership in the Youth Communist Organization while I was growing up in the Soviet Union?
I don't know. I wanted to ask you that question.
Well, Senator,
There was a group called the Young Communists, and you were a member. Is that right?
I'm not exactly sure which group you're referring to.
Well, the formal name of it is the Leninist Communist Young Union of the Russian Federation, and it's also known as the Leninist Komsomol of the Russian Federation, and it's commonly referred to as the Young Communists. Were you a member?
Senator, I was born and grew up in the Soviet Union.
Yes, ma'am, but were you a member of that organization?
Everybody in that country was a member of the Komsomol, which was the Communist Youth Organization, because
So you were a member?
that was a part of normal progress in school.
Have you resigned
From the
from the
youth,
Young Communists?
you grow out of it with age, automatically.
Did you send them a letter, though, resigning?
Senator, this was many, many years ago. As far as I remember how the Soviet Union worked, was at certain age, you automatically stop being a member of that
Could you look at your records and see if you can find a copy of your...
Senator Kennedy, I don't interrupt. I almost never interrupt these, but
Well, you always
Professor-
interrupt me, Mr.
no, actually, I
And
don't.
I
Not nearly as
won't
many
pursue-
times
I
as I'd
won't
like to.
pursue
No,
the line of
she
questions.
renounced her Soviet citizenship.
Well, I
She
understand
came
that,
here.
but you're not the witness, she is. Would you look at your records and see if you can find a letter of resignation for me?
Senator, as I explained, I was part of the Soviet population.
Yes, ma'am, I got that part. I just want to see if you look at your records and see if you find a letter of resignation. Let me tell you what, I've spent a lot of time on your record, and here's what I found. Look, this is America. You can believe what you want, but we can't just let anybody be controller of the currency. You wrote your thesis in college at Moscow State University on, the title was Karl Marx's Economic Analysis and the theory of revolution in the Capitol. But you won't send Senator Toomey a copy. You studied at Moscow State University, scientific communism, which is the science regarding the working class struggle and the socialist agenda. In 2019, not 30 years ago, in a Canadian documentary, you called the financial services industry, quote, a quintessential asshole industry. You wrote a paper called Systemically Significant Prices, calling for the federal government to set wages, food, gas prices. In 2020, you wrote a paper called The People's Ledger, where you said we need to abolish bank accounts and make everybody set up an account at the Fed where the federal government will have access to your data. In 2020, you wrote another paper called The Climate Case for a National Investment Authority, where you said what we need to do, the oil and gas industry, is have the federal government bankrupt them so we can tackle climate change. In 2019, you joined a Facebook group, a Marxist Facebook group, to discuss socialist and anti-capitalist views. Now, that's what I see from your record, and you have the right to believe every one of these things. You do. This is America. But I don't mean any disrespect. I don't know whether to call you professor or comrade.
Senator, I'm not a communist. I do not subscribe to that ideology. I could not choose where I was born. I do not remember joining any Facebook group that subscribes to that ideology. I would never knowingly join any such group. There is no record of me ever actually participating in any Marxist or communist discussions of any kind. My family suffered under the communist regime. I grew up without knowing half of my family. My grandmother herself escaped death twice under the Stalin regime. This is what's seared in my mind. That's who I am. I remember that history. I came to this country. I'm proud to be an American. And this is why I'm here today, Senator. I'm here today because I'm ready for public service.
Thank you, Professor. I checked with my staff, Senator Kennedy. I've never interrupted you or they believe anybody in the middle of their questioning.
Mr. Chairman, and I'm entitled to ask my questions.
And you were.
I didn't interrupt you when you gave your introduction, and I don't like being interrupted when I'm asking my questions.
Senator Kennedy, I heard.
It's called senatorial courtesy.
I understand that, and there's also senatorial courtesy.
And you may disagree with me, but that's why you have 5 minutes and I have 5 minutes.
Senator Kennedy, senatorial courtesy is also not doing character assassination. I heard Senator Scott.
Well, that's your opinion.
30 minutes
that's
ago.
Not my opinion.
30 minutes ago, I heard Senator Scott.
But I'm entitled to answer questions without you interrupting me. You and I don't agree. I still like you. We're friends. You have the right to your opinion, but I've got the right to mine. And you can't just interrupt me when I'm asking my question.
You still got a full 5. You still got a full 5 minutes.
And you've done it before.
Senator Scott, just a moment ago, said nobody on his side has done any kind of communist insinuation of her character and her background. He just said that, so I'm hopeful that Senator Scott and maybe perhaps Senator Tillis or Senator Toomey or Senator Kramer will call out those people that do character
Well, do you not think
Senator,
it's relevant
Senator Warren
is a member of the Young Communists?
I'm not here to answer your question, Senator Kennedy. Senator Warren is recognized for 5 minutes from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Omarova, I know that the giant banks object to your willingness to enforce the law to keep our system safe and that you may cut into big bank profits. So they and their Republican buddies have declared war on you. The attacks on your nomination have been vicious and personal. We've just seen them. Sexism, racism, pages straight out of Joe McCarthy's 1950s Red Scare tactics. It is all there on full display. Welcome to Washington in 2021. Now, one claim is that you intend to nationalize the banking system. So let's just get this nonsense out of the way. Does the OCC have the power to end private banking and to move all consumer deposits to a public ledger?
Absolutely not.
If the OCC did have that power, is that something you would support?
Absolutely not.
And are you a capitalist who believes in free markets?
Yes, I am.
So great. Now that we've put that on the record, I'd like to get to the real reason that your nomination has generated such fierce opposition. And I think it lies in what the OCC does have the power to do. Professor Omarova, the OCC oversees a mix of giant banks and smaller community banks. Now, the giant banks are flourishing and growing larger by the day. And big tech companies like Facebook are trying to move in, while many of the smaller banks are getting wiped out. As Comptroller, how would you support community banks and ensure that they can continue to provide strong service to their customers and competition in the banking industry?
Thank you, Senator. If confirmed as the Comptroller, I would make one of my priorities to take a much closer look and subject to much closer scrutiny the ongoing trend of consolidation in the banking industry that leaves many communities without meaningful access to banking services on the ground.
Well, you know, part of supporting community banks' role in our economy involves a level playing field with their larger peers, and that means accountability for those big banks. So, Professor Omarova, when a giant bank like Wells Fargo repeatedly breaks the law and cheats its customers, what do you believe our banking regulators should do?
I believe that banking regulators should use the tools in their toolkit to make sure that no bank, small or especially large, gets away with repeated violations of the law, especially when that hurts real families and real businesses on the ground. I think the fines should have a real bite. I think the executive compensation should be on the line for the big banks that continuously and repeatedly violate laws.
Whoa, Professor Omarova, I think I know why you're being attacked so viciously. These banks want to avoid accountability, and they certainly want to avoid personal liability for their executives, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to block you. Opposition to Professor Omarova has nothing to do with her qualifications or her ability to do this job. Professor Omarova will be an honest cop on the beat. She will not grovel before powerful banks and big tech companies. This is a vicious smear campaign coordinated by Republicans who are doing the bidding of giant banks that want to keep gobbling up smaller competitors, want to keep ripping off their customers, and want to keep getting away with it. Wall Street feels threatened, so they have launched an ugly personal assault on a respected person who never sought the spotlight. It is disgusting, and anyone who participates in this malicious character assassination should be ashamed of themselves. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Tillis from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Omarova, thank you for being here. I'd planned to spend my entire time providing or giving some questions. I probably will get to some of the questions that Senator Warner and Tester did on the Senate Bill 2155, but in light of comments made even by the prior senator, members of this committee, and certain members of the press, I want to make a few things crystal clear. Republican concerns with this nominee are directly tied solely to your extensive written record, period, full stop. With the exception of some of the comments that my friend and colleague, Senator Kennedy, made, I think that we've tried to focus on what we believe are legitimate policy differences and maybe academic differences. But an article ran yesterday in the New York Magazine claims that any opposition, and it's been said in this committee, to Dr. Omarova is modern-day McCarthyism. It's telling of the journalistic quality of the article, which purports to explain Republican opposition to you, that it only quotes Omarova supporters while failing to include a single interview on the record or a comment from a Republican member of this committee regarding our actual views. Comments and or innuendo made in the article, and even this hearing today, simply implies concerns with Dr. Omarova's nomination are due to, and I have to say, Dr. Omarova, you've said it yourself, to being an immigrant, a woman, and a minority, which I think are categorically false. I've hired women, I've hired immigrants, I've hired minorities, people of different gender identities, and I believe that many of my colleagues really reject that premise. Chairman Brown is reportedly livid that Republicans wish to ask about your written record and worldview, saying it's remarkable that we have stooped so low. I think it's remarkable that members of this committee are now chastised by the chair for expressing concerns over ideas repeated in numerous papers written by Dr. Omarova. The New York Magazine does get one thing right. It notes that the FDIC chair, Helena McWilliams, a female immigrant who came to the United States from then communist Yugoslavia, did not face questioning about her upbringing in a communist state during her nomination. I have no intention of doing that either, nor have most of the members of this committee. That's because nothing in Chair McWilliams' prior career speeches, policy writings, indicated she would bring a central planning, technocratic worldview to her position, as we infer from some of your writings and public statements. Dr. Omarova, on the other hand, has an extensive written record in that vein. I appreciate the New York Magazine's article helping clarify that point. As I did with Chair McWilliams, I will solely consider the content of your qualifications, your career, and your written records. And should Dr. Omarova feel that bipartisan reservations with her record expressed by sitting senators on both sides of the aisle are truly in her being an immigrant, a woman, and a minority, do you believe that to be the basis for any of the questions that have been asked of you today?
Well, Senator, I am a woman, I am a minority, and I am an immigrant. That is who I am. I cannot speak to anyone's personal reasons or professional reasons.
But you've at least said it. You've at least said it once that perhaps that was our motivation. But I think you'd be hard pressed to find any evidence today of that being the motivation of someone who may be concerned with your view, your academic writings, some of which you've said were just academic thoughtware, not necessarily something you wanted to put into practice. But I just don't see any basis for the so-called McCarthyism and the bias that members of this committee have suggested is our motivation. I'm going to go real quick. I am going to go to a second round. I do have a question about your thesis. I know that ranking member asked for your thesis about 7 weeks ago. It was not provided. It was not provided as of the deadline. It's been included on your resume since 2017. You said you forgot about it the day after you wrote it. But why is it that you have not responded to this committee and only recently said that it's because you can no longer find it?
Sorry, Senator. So this was an undergraduate paper I wrote about 32, 33 years ago in a system where there was absolutely no academic freedom. We had to write what we had to write in order to get our diplomas. It did not reflect my views then. It does not reflect my views now. I never thought that it would be such an important thing 33 years later. So when I, in 1991, was packing my one suitcase to come to America, it simply did not even occur to me to look up some typewritten version of some mandatorily assigned paper. So I didn't bring it with me. It was never published. It was never meant to be published.
Mr. Chair, just as a brief comment, for somebody who's lost family members in the time that she was young, for somebody who was growing up in Russia, I would think that some of the decisions that Dr. Omarova may have made back at the time had as much to do with survival as anything else. And so I don't have any concern with where she came from. You can't pick where you were born, and you chose the greatest nation on earth to become a citizen. My concerns are not with her background. I believe she did what so many people in the Soviet Union had to do to survive, but I have grave concerns with the policy positions and the idea that someone in such a powerful role could carry those forward and ultimately make them something that I believe could destroy the banking institutions in the United States. And I will be around for a second round.
Thank you, Senator Tillis. The committee, there's a stop time of noon, so we'll play this out and hope we get to that. I understand what you just said, and before calling on Senator Ossoff, I want to make clear the point of reference that you made about that paper. The committee only requires that nominees provide published writings. That's been the committee's practice for the 14 years I've been here, 13 years, or 14 years, and even Senator Shelby's, I think, for 30 years. She provided the committee with the required paperwork and then some. She did everything we required: 60 published writings, 120 speeches, 50 public statements. I'm not here to defend that. I'm here to point out that she did everything we asked, and the practice of the committee has not been that in the past and will not be. Ossoff is recognized from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Omarova, congratulations on your nomination. And thank you for meeting with me several weeks ago to discuss your worldview and your priorities should you be confirmed. My first question for you is, can you please comment on the implications for fiat currencies of the latest developments in financial technology, such as, for example, the proliferation and evolution of cryptocurrency technology?
Yes, thank you, Senator, for asking this very complex and very important question. I believe that now we are in the midst of a transformational period when the new technology has allowed the rise of digital currencies, particularly privately issued currencies, that offer a lot of potential benefits from the perspective of efficiency of payments, for example, efficiency of transactions in financial system, potentially increasing the level of financial inclusion because it's so easy and much cheaper now to transact in digital assets and digital currencies. All of that aside, it does raise a lot of issues with respect to the ability of our nation to maintain the dominant status of the US dollar in the global economy. Because the reason why we've been so far able to maintain that status, in addition to us, Americans, having the most dynamic and diverse and strong economy in the world, has been the fact that the Federal Reserve has been able to maintain the sort of the value of the dollar and to maintain the money supply in the economy so that our economy can thrive. And my concern is, and it's not only my concern of a lot of academics, is that in the system where a lot of private actors, particularly big private actors like Facebook, for example, can issue their own version of currency that can potentially outpace and even misplace the US dollar, that could have implications far beyond what we typically consider in the banking regulatory sphere, but it might undermine our monetary sovereignty and the value of the dollar.
Thank you. And what would be the implications, in your view, for monetary policymakers of the emergence of such privately issued digital currencies that were able to function effectively as media of exchange and stores of value?
Right. So currently, all the central bankers and many policymakers around the world are actively and intensely debating precisely that question that you've raised, Senator. And there are different options, potential options that different countries and different sets of policymakers might prefer. Congress could choose to regulate, for example, privately issued stablecoins that can compete with the official sovereign money, or Congress or policymakers could choose to enable the central bank, the Federal Reserve, to issue digital dollar, central bank digital currency, and make those decisions as they go.
And what, in your view, would be the potential utility of such a central bank digital currency, and how would it differ in its functionality and its implications for how capital markets and commerce unfold in the United States and around the world from traditional cash? So,
Senator, central bank digital currency, like any digital currency, would make a couple of things easier to achieve in the financial system than they are today. One is the efficiency of moving money around. And that's very important because the efficiency of payments, the efficiency of transactions is an incredible risk-reducing tool in the financial system. The other thing is access. With the new technology and particularly the issuance of CBDC or any other private stablecoins, it's much easier to enable everybody to have access to money. The one potential advantage of CBDC over private stablecoins is that it will be issued subject to statutory mandate, legal decisions made by democratically elected lawmakers like yourselves. And so that would allow the central bank, under the oversight of Congress, for example, or the legislature, to ensure that everybody has fair access to the new form of money.
Thank you for your testimony. Congratulations again on your nomination. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Senator Haggerty from Tennessee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Omarova, you've spent your career coming up with proposals that are designed to radically transform America's financial sector, even though America's financial markets are the envy of the free world. So your nomination to a senior government role underscores that President Biden and the Democrats are driving America full speed down the collapse road towards socialism. I have some basic questions to ask you, Dr. Omarova. Do you accept the basic economic principles of supply and demand? A yes or no answer will be fine.
Yes, I do.
Thank you. In general, when something costs more, all else being equal, do people tend to buy less of it? Again, a yes or no answer would be fine.
It's hard to tell.
When something costs more, all else being equal, do people tend to buy less of it?
If it is something without which you cannot survive, or if your child needs it, you're going to pay whatever you have to pay.
I think that the design of the administration here is pretty clear. When President Biden was elected, regular gas cost an average across the United States $2.10 a gallon. Now, the price has been driven up to $3.40 a gallon on average across the United States. In many places, it's much more expensive, and those prices are rising, again, putting pressure on people's ability to purchase gasoline, to purchase fuel. Dr. Omarova, do you think that higher gas prices are good for America or bad for America? Yes or no answer would be fine there.
Senator, that's a tricky question because I do remember Hurricane Katrina.
Are higher gas prices good for America or bad for America, Doctor?
It's probably bad for America. It's not my expertise. I'm not sure exactly what you're asking.
Mr. Chairman, I'd let the record reflect that this witness is having a hard time acknowledging that higher gas prices are bad for America. Last week, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki stated that the Biden administration's view is that the rise in prices that we're seeing in gas over the long term make an even stronger case for doubling down on our investment and our focus on clean energy options. Do you agree with her statement? Yes or no will be fine.
Excuse me, what is the statement that you're asking?
Her statement is that higher gas prices, these rising gas prices, actually help justify the investments that the Biden administration want to make in green energy. Do you agree with that?
Senator, I cannot say yes or no with respect to agreeing with a statement or the context of which I'm not familiar with.
Well, let me say this, that many folks that are advocates, as you seem to be, of the green energy program that we're talking about, suggest that higher gas prices do support the cost justification for green investment. Now, you've already said that, or at least have had some difficulty, but I think you think that higher gas prices are bad for America. Yet there's a belief that higher gas prices help cost justify investment in the Green New Deal. And my colleagues have brought out the fact that you've talked about wanting to bankrupt the oil and gas industry in order to help you achieve your green dreams, and higher gas prices help justify that pursuit. So I'm trying to understand, Dr. Omarova, which would be the priority? Do you want lower gas prices, which would help prevent Americans from going bankrupt? Or do you want to use the authority of the OCC, of the Comptroller, to bankrupt oil and gas industries, as you stated in the past?
Senator, I have never stated that the OCC should use the powers of the bank regulator to bankrupt oil and gas companies.
I'm going to come back to your statement. You said that, I'm going to come back to an exact quote. I think Senator Crapo read this earlier, that a lot of the smaller players in the coal, the oil, the gas industries are going to probably go bankrupt in short order. At least we want them to go bankrupt if we want to tackle climate change. This is very disturbing. I would say this, Americans are really hurting because of rising gas prices. Yet the Biden administration has taken step after step to destroy the oil and gas industry in America. They've destroyed our energy independence. They've killed pipeline projects. They're using regulatory authority to make it far more difficult to explore new oil and gas. And gas prices are going up dramatically as a result. And now we're talking about doubling down on this and putting someone into a position that can actually utilize the oversight of our financial system to cancel America's individual businesses. I want to come back to something that you said in the past. In a May interview, you were asked, how do you stop carbon financing? How do you make sure that existing financial systems and private asset managers don't continue to lend to carbon activities? How do you not have carbon financing leakages? That was the question that was put to you, Doctor. Did you answer, and I quote, "I completely agree with you. The way we get basically rid of those carbon financiers is that we starve them of their sources of capital." Again, did you say that?
Senator, this was meant, when I said we, I meant we as private investors, as free actors in the free market economy. As an investor, I have a right to choose where I put my money, and that was the context in which I said
that
any of those
underscores your
things.
viewpoint. I believe this happened just in May that you made that statement. Dr. Omarova, President Biden and the Democrats are talking about putting you in charge of an army of 2,400 bank examiners with a war chest of $1 billion. I want to ask you a simple yes or no question again. Are you familiar with Operation Chokepoint?
Yes.
Okay, I thought you would be. To explain it to everybody else, Doctor, Operation Chokepoint was a program in which government officials intimidated banks to stop lending to lawful American businesses that Democrats didn't like. It was called Operation Chokepoint because the government abused its authority to try to choke off the financial oxygen from those targeted lawful businesses. I hope my Democrat colleagues fully understand why someone who cheers bankrupting law-abiding American businesses by starving them of capital, businesses that just happen to be out of political favor at the time, that's breathtakingly disturbing, especially given the position of responsibility that we're talking about Dr. Omarova potentially taking. Millions of American livelihoods depend on oil and gas jobs. Gas prices are soaring right now. It isn't even winter, and the Biden administration wants to cut American oil and gas. This is bad for
Senator's
national
time's
security.
way over. If you care to answer quickly, you may. Again.
Senator, I actually agree with you. Oil and gas industry is a very important part of the American economy. If confirmed as the Comptroller, I have absolutely no intention of using the powers of that office to force banks to stop lending to oil and gas companies. I have never said that. The one unfortunately phrased sentence, I tried to explain what I was trying to say there. But I completely agree with you, and I agree with your indignation.
Thank you. Senator Van Hollen is recognized from Maryland for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, we just had a previous presidential administration that thought climate change was a hoax, despite what people can see with their eyes. And what the Biden administration is trying to do is promote more clean energy sources, things like wind, things like solar, and there are a lot of people who don't like that. Of course, this has very little to do with what the OCC's charge is, but I think it's important to recognize what this administration's up to. The President Biden was just over at the global conference. President Trump chose to pull us out of that. Those are choices presidents make. But with respect to the OCC and with some of the issues that have been raised regarding your background, there was a moment as I was tuning in on TV that I thought I was flashing back to the McCarthy hearings. Let me ask you this, Dr. Omarova, because apparently at least some individuals have forgotten that in totalitarian regimes, in communist regimes, people have little freedom of choice in many cases. Isn't that true?
That is absolutely true, Senator.
And in the case where you were actually able to make some choices under that regime, when you were pursuing or after you had completed your undergraduate degree in philosophy, you were admitted to a PhD program at Moscow State University. And there you were able to choose the topic to study. What topic did you choose?
I chose to study the modern theory of American democracy because I was interested in learning how the American democracy, the best democracy in the world, works.
And soon after that, you also looked for opportunities to come to the United States on student exchanges. Isn't that true?
I have been looking for that opportunity for quite a while by then, yes.
Right. And when you succeeded in doing that, when you arrived here, when you had interaction with the American financial system and capitalism, what was the experience? What was your response given where you'd come from?
I felt like I was able to breathe for the first time, like there was air in my lungs. And I will never forget that feeling. And that is what I value about this country. I value free markets. I value free enterprise. I understand very well the need to preserve the ability of private banking institutions and private businesses to allocate capital to the best uses. That is not at all what I'm writing against. What I'm writing against is the repetition of the 2008 crisis type things, when certain large institutions are able to privatize their gains by engaging in risky activities and then socialize the losses on the American taxpayer. That is what I'm writing about. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Look, I just, clearly people can have differences of opinion on things that you've written, on policy issues, but the line of questioning I overheard earlier, again, suggesting that somehow you were a full and willing participant in the communist system and the Soviet Union, in my view, took this hearing down a very different road. Let me ask you about something that you will be involved in as a member of the Financial Stability Oversight Council, and that's cybersecurity. Because I think we see every day that cyber attacks pose threats to our power grids and many other pieces of our important infrastructure, and that includes our financial system. What thoughts do you have as to the risks that are currently being posed and what additional actions that we need to take to protect that system from cyber attacks?
Thank you, Senator. You are asking a very, very important question. I believe that cybersecurity is probably #1 threat to the systemic stability of our financial markets, because cyber attacks are already causing tremendous economic losses to banks and their customers, but more than that, they pose a serious national security threat. One shudders to imagine what might happen if a particular attack takes out, let's say, the entire Federal Reserve System. That would be incredibly bad for everyone. I think that if I'm confirmed as the next comptroller, I would start by, again, talking to the professionals at the OCC and at other financial regulators with respect to how we can combine our forces and work together better or continue working together and focus on the use of new technologies to protect our banks and their customers from cyber attacks, and also to think about how we can increase the level and the depth of expertise at financial regulators on technical issues specifically related to cyber attacks. I think that might be one of the specific issues on which the industry, the regulated industry, the banks, and the regulators, and FinCEN, of course, and the Treasury folks can work together on figuring out practical tools of meeting that threat.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator. Now, Senator Lummis from Wyoming is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and I want to thank you, Dr. Omarova, for meeting with me in my office the other day. When we visited, I had never read anything you'd written. I have since read some of the things you've written. And it seems to me there's a big disconnect between the person I met in my office and your writings. So some of the things I'm concerned about now are how you view some of the things you've written and said in the last 3 years or so with what you'll take with you into the OCC as a regulator. So I want to ask you some of those questions. Do you believe that federal bank regulators, through the use of capital requirements, loan loss reserves, and supervisory standards, have the legal authority to starve an industry of their sources of capital?
Senator, I do not believe that is right. I do not believe that any federal regulator should have as its goal to starve any specific company of capital. Those decisions should be left to private banks allocating credit.
Will you pledge today not to repeat Operation Chokepoint and politicize the banking industry by targeting socially suboptimal companies?
Senator, I will, if confirmed as the Comptroller of the Currency, I will make sure that that agency acts only within its legal mandate and performs its mission and does not step into the shoes of Congress and other policymakers who need to make those substantive decisions. That I completely can, get on board with.
I want to explore a little bit some of your discussions about stablecoins, CBDCs. I got the impression that you believe only in fiat currency. Am I correct in that regard?
No, Senator. Well, let me explain that as an academic, I am struggling with figuring out, what the future holds with respect to digital currencies. We are very much in the state of flux now. Technologies are evolving very quickly. My concern, and I have expressed those concerns, is that despite all of the obvious benefits of private digital assets or digital currencies with respect to efficiencies, inclusion, and all these other benefits, we may end up in a situation where, for example, a large company, like a big tech company, might control all of the infrastructure through which the money that every American family, every American business uses in their daily lives moves.
That bothers you?
That worries me.
Why?
Because private companies, as you know, are pursuing private profits, and that is absolutely what they should be doing. And sometimes the pursuit of private profit may cut into our public interest in, for example, allowing everybody equal access, safe access to money.
How do you think that you as a regulator can make the judgments calls that people don't have adequate access to capital when countries like El Salvador have recognized Bitcoin as legal tender specifically to grant people more access to capital?
Senator, I have not been to El Salvador, but my understanding is that before El Salvador recognized Bitcoin as its official currency, they were using US dollar. And the US dollar is, to me, the best money in the world.
Okay, so do you believe, I want to return to that question, do you believe that a government-issued representation of currency, of value, is superior to private commerce?
I believe that we do have government-issued money right now in this country, and it's working great. And I worry about allowing private innovation to undermine a lot of important public policies that we need to pursue in this country.
Okay, and what are those public policies?
Well, for example, national security. National security is a very important public policy.
Do you think that Bitcoin threatens national security?
I am not an expert on Bitcoin, but I would worry if all of our financial transactions were up to some blockchain system where, various actors who might actually be located in other countries, not particularly friendly to us, control the functioning of that system. That would be my worry, yes.
You did respond to the gentleman from Rhode Island about concerns about stablecoins and that could reduce the Federal Reserve's ability to execute monetary policy. Monetary policy is carried out in the capital markets, not by the Federal Reserve. Money creation takes place today in the form of commercial bank money from lending. So a stablecoin that's issued by a bank would also be a commercial bank money backed 100% by reserves. So I'm struggling with your view about digital assets. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank
I
you,
yield
Senator
back.
Lummis. Senator Cortez Masto from Nevada is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Dr. Omarova, thank you for meeting with me, and congratulations on your nomination. Let me start here. In previous administration, the Comptroller of the Currencies stated that he saw banks as the agency's customers. In your extensive research and expertise, is it important that banking regulators see the protection of the markets and consumers as their main responsibility?
Yes, Senator, thank you for this very important question. Absolutely. The OCC, just like any other banking regulator on the federal level, is a public agency, and it has a public purpose that was established for it by Congress. The customers of the OCC are American families, American businesses, farms, working people, everybody. Banks alone are not the customers of the OCC. It doesn't mean that the OCC shouldn't be working with banks closely. If confirmed as the Comptroller, I fully intend to have an open door policy, an open mind policy, and I'm willing to work with any bank of any size that is willing to channel credit into the real economy.
Thank you. And so let me touch on that, because across the nation, community banks are merging and closing branches in rural areas. In Nevada, as a result of the 2008 financial crisis, a number of financial institutions closed, primarily those concentrated in our more rural communities. So what can the OCC do to support and strengthen community banks that help them meet their communities' banking and credit needs?
Yes, thank you, Senator. Community banking is extremely important to the thriving of our American economy. And if confirmed as the Comptroller, it will be one of my top priorities to make sure that community banks have all the support from their regulator that they need in order to engage in innovative practices carefully and responsibly, in order to perform their main lines of business, channeling credit into the communities. I would make sure that, at least I would do my best to make sure that they play on a level playing field, that they're protected from unfair competition from tech companies and other less regulated entities, and that the regulatory burden on community banks is completely appropriate for the level of risks they pose, which is a lot lower than the risks posed by large, complex financial institutions.
Thank you. Now, there's some consensus for a change to the Community Reinvestment Act to reflect the growth of online banking, a larger financial services ecosystem, and others. Have you given any thought to any changes to this CRA, and how do you think the OCC should work with the other regulators on any changes made to the CRA?
Thank you. I do believe that the CRA is an incredibly important tool in the toolkit of bank regulators to ensure that banks provide financial services, channel investments, and provide credit to low-income and moderate-income communities and communities of color, rural communities, all those sort of communities that are currently known as banking deserts. And I am very happy that the current acting Comptroller has resumed the OCC's effort to collaborate with other financial regulators on a comprehensive revamping of the CRA to account for the new technologies and new abilities to serve that purpose.
Yes, and I too am appreciative of that collaboration now. Let me just jump to anti-money laundering. Terrorists and other malicious actors have gotten more sophisticated in their money laundering efforts. And how would you work to enforce anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism finance laws?
Yes, I am very much attuned to the importance of enforcing anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing laws and regulations. It's extremely important. If confirmed as the Comptroller, one of the first actions I intend to take is to talk very seriously to the professional staff at the OCC and to see what they understand as the main practical issues and challenges on the ground that we need to address. My understanding is that we need to continue and strengthen the cooperation with FinCEN, with law enforcement agencies, with other financial regulators to make sure that even with the advent of new technologies that may make some of those untoward activities easier to hide, we as banking regulators stand vigilant and are able to uphold the law.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Omarova.
Thanks, Senator Cortez Masto. Senator Kramer from North Dakota is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Professor, for being here. You've done a pretty good job of bifurcating previous opinions, papers, policy positions that you've bifurcated from this job. As though judgment doesn't matter, even if it's technically true. I mean, we didn't ask you if you're a Vikings fan or a Colts fan or a Chicago Bears fan. These judgments, statements you've made matter a lot, even if you don't have direct legal authority for a particular policy. But I want to pretend for a minute that you and I are in the faculty lounge, okay? And you're not applying for this really important job. Do you believe that starving the U.S. oil and gas industries of its capital, even though you have no intention of doing that as the comptroller, do you believe that if you could lead to the bankruptcy of all the oil and gas companies in America, that would actually help climate change?
Well, Senator, first of all, let me tell you that I would love to engage you in a conversation at the faculty lounge, but in the faculty lounge, people typically do not ask questions in the form, do you believe? But I am very confident in telling you that I believe that the oil and gas industry is an important part of the American economy. However, I also believe that there are important issues in the long term. As a human being, as a person, as a mother, I want my child to live in the world that doesn't suffer from hurricanes of unusual proportions, from fires that devastate farms. All of that stuff is happening. I'm not an expert on climate change. What I do know is that the Comptroller of the Currency, of course, is not a climate regulator.
But, and I appreciate all of that. My question, though, is more about, and I'll make the point, America's role in this, and America's role in the solution, versus what people like John Kerry and Gina McCarthy are advocating, which is really transferring their climate guilt to polluting countries. Like somehow if we shut down the industry in the United States, that Russian natural gas or Venezuelan oil or Saudi oil somehow doesn't have a negative impact on the climate, that we'll all be better if we just starve capital in the United States of America. I would submit to you that building up the oil and gas industry in the United States of America would have a greater impact on reducing climate change than starving it. I want to get to another previous lecture, and I have to say it's really rich to be lectured by the senator from Massachusetts about vicious personal attacks. So she spends 5 minutes pretty much every hearing doing exactly that, depending on who the witness is. But there's been a lot said about why it would be obvious that Wall Street banks don't support your nomination. Why do you suppose independent banks don't? Because the Independent Community Banks of America and several state independent banking groups also strongly oppose your nomination. It's not all about Wall Street. And so if you're such a pro-community banker, why do you think that they oppose you so strongly?
You know, Senator, I'm with you on that. I wish the community bankers and their association, trade association, actually read more carefully what I've written, because what I've written, in fact, differs fundamentally from the descriptions of what I've written that have been, proliferating in the media. I cannot speak to the reasons as to why a particular trade association supports or opposes a particular nomination. All I can say is that if I'm the comptroller, community banks will find no better or stronger ally than they would find in me.
Okay, I'm going to try to drill down just a little more on this statement about socially suboptimal. And you've refused to answer what you believe a socially suboptimal industry might be. Do you think that a regulator ought to have the authority to determine what a suboptimal, socially suboptimal industry is, and then make determinations on whether they ought to be lent to by a community bank, a large bank, a Wall Street bank, or an independent investor?
Senator, I believe that regulators should never substitute their policy judgment for the judgment of Congress. When I said suboptimal policies, I meant for Congress to make those policy decisions. What kind of activities we want to support, what kind of activities we don't want to support, it is ultimately up to Congress. It is not the regulator's job. I completely agree with you on this one.
I actually happen to think that all the right incentives are already in place for risk assessment by the banks themselves. But anyway, with that, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the way.
Thank you, Senator Kramer. Senator Daines from Montana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I do want to join my colleagues in expressing extreme concern with the nomination of Professor Omarova to head the Office of Comptroller of the Currency. Professor's extreme views on energy, her desire to nationalize retail banking, to place government officials on private company boards, have the government set price controls on food, gas, and other everyday goods, and her hostility toward innovation in the digital currency space are just a few of the reasons that Montanans and the Americans should be very concerned about this radical nomination. What is said in the past, what is said in academic writings, what we say publicly matters. And you can't run away, a nominee can't run away from what they've said in the past, whether it's an academic setting or not. Each one of us here has run for public office. What we've said in the past, what we've written in the past matters. And that's what we use as a basis to determine if someone is qualified or not to serve in these very important capacities. In March of 2021 seminar, just 8 months ago, Professor Omarova stated with regard to oil, gas, and coal companies that, quote, "We want them to go bankrupt if we want to tackle climate change," end quote. That's very clear. In May of this year, Professor Omarova went further and called for debanking these industries, stating that, quote, "The way we basically get rid of these carbon financiers is we starve them of their source of capital," end quote. These are chilling statements and beliefs, and I believe they are disqualifying for someone seeking to hold such a powerful office. The fact that President Biden would even make such a nomination further solidifies how radically liberal and out of touch the mainstream views of the White House are. Professor Omarova, in a 2017 paper entitled "Bank Governance and Systemic Stability, the Golden Share Approach," you advocated for a fundamental structural reconfiguration of bank governance by giving the federal government a seat on the board of each systemically important banking organization. You specifically proposed that government, and I quote you, "take partial ownership stakes in firms in order to exercise voice in the deliberations that ultimately issue in firms' decisions," end quote. You also proposed giving the federal government power to manage financial institutions directly if certain conditions are met by, and I quote, "grant direct but conditional management rights to a designated government representative on the board of each affected institution." Professor, I lived in China for 6 years, working for Procter & Gamble. I've seen the effects of when big government, when communist governments try to take over the private sector. Placing government officials on boards of banks to propose that is chilling. Do you still believe that the government should have seats on the boards of private companies?
Senator, thank you for bringing up this particular paper and allowing me to clarify that comment. So the idea of a golden share did not come from China or from the Soviet Union. In fact, to me, it came from reading about Margaret Thatcher's government, their decision to introduce the golden share mechanism with respect to the newly privatized in the 1980s strategically important companies. This is where I drew my inspiration for the idea, just kind of to push the envelope a little bit, of thinking about if we can introduce a very contingent and very limited ability for the public voice in the in the governance of systemically important financial institutions only under situations when the financial stability, systemic stability, and national security are threatened.
So I just want to be clear, okay, but you do still, and you put conditions to it, but you still believe that the government should, in some situations, have seats on the boards of corporations.
Yeah, I'm with Margaret Thatcher on this one.
I can't speak for Margaret Thatcher here this morning, but I got to believe if Margaret Thatcher had a vote on your nomination, she would be opposed to it. Returning to your comments earlier this year saying you want oil and gas companies to go bankrupt. In that statement, you specifically said you hope that small oil, gas, and coal companies go bankrupt. Your exact words were, quote, a lot of the smaller players in the industry are going to probably go bankrupt in short order. At least we want them to go bankrupt if we want to tackle climate change. Professor, do you believe that is the role of the federal government to specifically target small, family-owned businesses in an attempt to bankrupt them, destroying their livelihoods and the communities that they support?
Senator, once again, like I said before, what I was actually saying in that comment was the opposite, that we need to find new ways of helping small energy companies get through the hard times so that their workers do not lose their jobs. That hurts local economies. I completely agree with...
Wait a minute, you said at least we want them to go bankrupt if we want to tackle climate change.
So that one sentence I already said, I'm sorry that I misspoke. It was not a well-phrased sentence, but the meaning, and I insist on that,
I think the
was
meaning is pretty clear.
different.
Mr. Chairman, let me just close, if I might. The dominant theme of your career has been promoting very radical socialist ideas. The position you have been nominated for would put you in a position to implement some of these ideas. The thought of that is chilling, and this committee, in my opinion, should unanimously reject your nomination.
Thank you, Senator Daines. There is time for a second round for the ranking member and for me. Then there, of course, are QFRs available to everyone. We announced
Mr.
earlier.
Chairman,
Yeah, Senator.
I really want to strongly object to this. Everybody on our side, virtually everybody, has other questions that have not been covered, and there's a second round that they would like to have. We communicated this very clearly some time ago. We would be perfectly happy for you to designate anyone you choose. I would volunteer, but it certainly doesn't have to be me. Anyone you choose could simply recognize people in whatever order. I really think it's completely premature to try to shut down this hearing at this point.
Senator Toomey, I am certainly not shutting it down. We announced earlier that the hearing would end at 12. We started the hearing a half an hour earlier. This is, I think, the biggest turnout on your side of any time since I've chaired, and I know there's interest, but that's the purpose that QFRs always follow. So the decision of the chair stands.
If QFRs were adequate, Mr. Chairman, we wouldn't have hearings. There's a reason that we have hearings. It is so that we can have a thorough discussion. This is one of the most powerful financial regulators in the world that we're talking about, and members have a lot of substantive questions. They should have a right to ask those questions.
And they have 2.5 hours of questions. So that's the decision I'm making. I will begin my questions and then turn to Senator Toomey. There are those, mainly senators, Professor Omarova, who like to tout this institution as the world's greatest debating society, but when debate turns to complex, nuanced issues, the substance and the context are often lost. So let's break it down one more time. Professor, is your concern about the end of banking primarily driven by rapid technological change that threatens local community banks? Is that your concern?
Yes, it is.
You believe that rapid technological change already threatens local community banks, is that correct?
Absolutely, yes.
So your papers are part of the debate trying to imagine how we ensure the ongoing viability of local community banks, is that correct?
That's absolutely correct.
So you're sounding an alarm, if I'm reading this right, you're sounding an alarm about the future of community banks, absolutely not calling for their end, correct?
That is absolutely correct.
So to be clear, you support, and then thank you for that. Let me turn to 2155, which has been mischaracterized by a number of people. You support tailored regulation for community banks who don't engage in the risky activities of the largest Wall Street banks, correct?
I absolutely do.
And you supported provisions of 2155, as I did, I was opposed to the bill, but supported a number of provisions to tailor regulations for relationship banks, correct?
Yes, I strongly supported those provisions.
And many of my colleagues supported 2155 because regulators testified that it would reduce burden for small banks. Is it correct that your concern was that regulators would use 2155, that law, would use 2155 authorities to lower capital and regulatory requirements for large, complex foreign banking operations and organizations?
That was exactly my sole concern with that bill, and
As
just
was
that.
mine. Thank you. Last set of questions. We hear our friends talking about the term socially suboptimal a lot today, a term I'm not sure I really was very familiar with before. Doesn't this simply refer to a basic free market economic principle that some activities have undesirable social outcomes or externalities?
Yes, it does.
I'm on the Ag Committee. I've worked in a bipartisan way to improve farm conservation programs. Would farming practices that incentivize erosion and animal waste runoff be socially suboptimal?
I think they would be. I'm not an expert in agriculture.
I think you're right. Congress, whether in the form of in the Farm Bill or elsewhere, addresses socially suboptimal practices all the time, correct?
That's absolutely correct.
And that's, if you would expand on this a bit, that's what you're referring to, that Congress can and does regulate behavior it believes as socially suboptimal, whether that's farm conservation, food free of sawdust, and medicines that include ingredients actually on that label. That's what you're referring to, that Congress can and does regulate behavior it believes are socially suboptimal.
That's exactly what I believe in, and that's exactly what I was referring to. It's up to Congress to define those.
And that's what you were writing about?
That's what I'm writing about, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's go back for a second to the thesis issue, which some have suggested somehow should be irrelevant. The reason I think it's relevant is Professor Omarova chose to advertise her thesis on her resume right up through 2017. And that's why I asked for it. But Professor Omarova, you didn't reply to my request, but you did give interviews in the media citing the reasons why it shouldn't be relevant, reasons why it didn't matter, you didn't believe it then, or you don't believe it now, or both. But isn't it true that you waited until this past Friday to inform my staff that you actually don't have a copy of it?
Senator, I did
Kind of true-false. Is it true that you informed my staff on Friday that you don't have a copy of it?
I did inform them, yes.
Yeah. It just seems odd that we would have to wait 6 weeks to discover that, oh, you don't have it after all. And it seems odd that you would make all these arguments for why it shouldn't need to be turned over if that's all a moot point. Let me go to this issue of allocation of capital, because I'm pretty sure I heard you say that you support the private allocation of capital. That's what you're saying here before us this morning. But you have cast enormous doubts in so much of what you have said and written. It's very clear you are deeply skeptical about a private allocation of capital, and you think the government would do a better job. It's your quotes. You did a podcast recently, I think it was, and it's called The Banking and Finance, a Law and Political Economy Project. And it was in June of this year. You said, and I quote, "We need to correct the misallocation of money and credit in the U.S. economy, and we need to correct it on a systemic level." End quote. Another quote, you said, "We need to make sure banks channel money and financial resources precisely where, as the nation, as a community, really need it to go." End quote. Another quote, you say, "Why don't we revive a greater public role in the capital markets and financial markets, to a role not just of rule maker, cop, janitor, but a role of actual market participants?" These are all your words. In that same interview, you said, and I quote, "We need to think about how to change the mindset about how we think about the role of federal government vis-a-vis private business. It's a team sport. And in the team sport, we all win or we all lose under the same circumstances. And you know, every team requires a captain, and so the federal government should step into that role and should become the captain in terms of allocation of resources. And I think that what the government needs to do is it needs to step into the private market operations, right, in order to align the incentives of individual corporations with the interest of the public," end quote. That's a lengthy quote, and I did it to provide the context, the repeated context in which you are deeply critical of the idea of a free enterprise system privately allocating capital, and you express a preference for the government allocation of capital. And what worries us is this is not like an idle suggestion that was thrown off the cuff. You've developed a whole framework for how to implement this. This NIA that you conceive of is really meant to be like a government-owned private equity venture to allocate capital in ways that you prefer. And I have to underscore, the powers that you would have, including discretionary powers, are enormous. And when you combine this deep skepticism about private allocation, advocacy of government intervention, advocacy for greater government involvement, and let's get away from the regulators just being referees on the field and have them be more, remember, I mean, you advocated that the Federal Reserve set prices across our economy by openly buying and selling commodities to manipulate the price to where the Fed wants it to be. And as the head of the OCC, and you'd said you'd only do what's within its legal mandate. The problem is its legal mandate is very broad, and there's a lot that's discretionary. You would get to decide who gets to open a bank and who doesn't. You'd get to decide what kind of loans can be made and which ones can't. You could forbid a bank from a merger. You could forbid a bank from opening new branches. You could create or destroy a whole category of bank charters. You could decide which kinds of loans receive favorable regulatory treatment through the CRA eligibility. And every bank would know that their fate is to a very large degree in your hands, and they would know what your views are about the banking industry, about the private allocation of capital. This is what's so chilling. I think this answers the question of why so many, including community banks, are very, very concerned about where you would take the office of the Comptroller of the Currency.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. We have, prior to this hearing, we had witnessed, in my memory, the worst character assassination aimed at a nominee since I've been here. For a while in this hearing, I was encouraged. My colleagues tried sticking to policy, although misstating Professor Omarova's positions, taking many of her works out of context. Senator Scott, to his credit, came here and stated that no Republican member had attacked Dr. Omarova for coming from the former Soviet Union. Minutes later, Senator Kennedy repeated the same vile, disgusting attacks we've heard all along, the same attacks I mentioned in my opening. Attacking a nominee's positions is one thing. Calling a nominee comrade, as if we don't know what that means, is something else. It's beneath the dignity of this institution. I came here hoping that we can focus on what matters, on fair questions about writings and records and statements and plans for this job. We've heard from Professor Omarova in her own words how she'll be a fair comptroller, a reasonable comptroller, a comptroller that will make sure everyone plays on a level playing field. We welcome that. She'll work to ensure community banks can provide credit and provide financial investments to communities throughout the country she loves. That's what type of controller she will be. Thank you for appearing today. Productive discussion for senators who wish to submit questions, and I know there will be many. Those questions are due at the close of business on Monday, the 22nd of November. To Ms. Omarova, we'd like to have your responses by Tuesday, November 30th at the latest. With that,
Mr. Chairman, you said we'd have a round of questions. Okay. You and I both did, and you just made a closing statement. I'd like to make a brief closing statement. Thank you. Look, the conclusion, it's very, very clear. Over a long period of time, consistently, repeatedly, in multiple media, Professor Omarova has promoted radical is her description, nationalizing the banking system, imposing government price controls, espousing the idea that money is a public, not a private good, curtailing economic innovation, dramatically limiting economic freedom and choice, having the government seize seats on corporate boards. The list goes on and on. These are ideas consistent with the socialist view of a command and control economy. That's what this is. That is the definition. In addition, she has promoted anti-democratic ideas such as this National Investment Authority, which is explicitly meant to be outside of the realm of Congress and empower that to allocate resources. The idea that we would put a person with these views as the chief regulator of America's national banks with the enormous powers that I just delineated, this is what is deeply disturbing and chilling, and why I recommend to my colleagues that we not support, not confirm this nominee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. The committee is adjourned.